Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。This week, the 10 members of BRICS are meeting for their 16th summit, and the first since the Intergovernmental Alliance officially grew to 10 members early this year. Western media is already terrified about what might be discussed, including plans to end the hegemony of the US dollar by creating an alternative international payments platform that is quote-unquote immune to Western sanctions. But what might that look like? Is a new BRICS currency on the cards? Today I'll ask all that and more of my special guest, Professor Warwick Powell. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. The now 10-country-strong BRICS met in Kazan, Russia this week for their 16th annual summit, and the first since Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Ethiopia joined on January 1 of this year. But what is the point of the meeting? Well, Reuters ran with the headline, "At BRICS Summit, Russia to push to end dollar dominance," where they say, Russia is seeking to convince BRICS countries to build an alternative platform for international payments that would be immune to Western sanctions. President Vladimir Putin is keen to build up BRICS as a powerful counterweight to the West in global politics and trade. The article goes on to say that the summit will feature a proposal for a new payment system via a network of commercial banks, and that the system would use blockchain technology to store and transfer digital tokens backed by national currencies. This, in turn, would then allow those currencies to be easily and securely exchanged, bypassing the need for dollar transactions. To find out more, I'm joined by Adjunct Professor Warwick Powell from the Queensland University of Technology and Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute, who recently penned a piece for CGTN called BRICS and Currency Multipolarity, Adding to the Emerging Fabric, the link for which is in the video description down below. Professor, welcome back to the show. First up today, a really basic question that I'm sure many viewers will be relieved that I've put to you. What exactly is blockchain?
It can be a big question to answer, but hopefully I'll do justice and answer it as briefly as I can. Blockchain is a technology that basically describes what we would call a distributed ledger. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that a common ledger, which is, let's just call it a set of notes about, who's got what, is maintained across a network of computers so that there is a copy of this particular ledger on a number of computers that all of the relevant stakeholders actually have responsibility for. Why is that important? Well, because it reduces the risk, firstly, of a single point of system failure. So if you've only got one copy of something, a really important record of who's got what, then that one copy of something getting lost or destroyed or tampered with becomes a real problem for everybody. The second reason why a distributed ledger is important is that it actually comes with a set of rules that the participants agree upon, which drives how that ledger is updated. So no single actor gets to update that ledger without adherence to the set of rules that they've all agreed on. And that's important because you don't want an environment where a single actor can either for good or other reasons meddle with the ledger of accounts. The third reason why a distributed ledger can become important is that it facilitates the ability for different actors to be collectively responsible for the integrity of the information system itself. So in many regards, it means that those who are using a ledger to conduct business between each other need to have confidence that that record is accurate and that everybody shares in that record. It's not something that I've got a copy of and you've got a different copy of and we hope that they match up, but it's something that we actually all share the common copy, and that brings with it a level of informational integrity into financial transactions, but other kinds of transactions that the parties can all agree upon. And that, in short, is a distributed ledger, and a blockchain is a variety of a distributed ledger.
So what might that look like as part of a BRICS payment system? And does this mean that there won't be like a new BRICS type paper currency created?
Look, I think the world is moving heavily towards digitalization in any regard, and the role of tangible money, whether it's in notes or in coins, is diminishing quite significantly across particularly the advanced economies. And I suspect that over time it will further diminish across the world. That's not to say that there isn't a role for physical forms of money, but that predominantly transactions will be transacted and recorded on digital ledgers. The idea of a distributed ledger for a BRICS payment settlement system is to ensure that each of the participating countries' central banks are collectively responsible for operating this ledger. So this is the idea of there being no single actor within this network being able to superimpose their desires upon a network, either by meddling with the ledger, changing it, adding things to it, deleting things from it, or, of course, stopping people from using that ledger. In other words, sanctioning and prohibiting people from using it. So the first thing is that the central banks of the member states are likely to be responsible for operating the foundational ledger upon which the cross-border payment system then operates. Once we've done that, it's hard to know exactly what the design parameters will look like, because the discussion paper that was released about a week or so ago in preparations for the BRICS meeting in Kazan didn't go into a lot of detail. So there is a little bit of guesswork or reading between the lines, and perhaps a little bit of speculation as to what some of the technical design parameters might look like. Now, one of the projects that is already up and running globally, which may contribute to some of the design thinking around a BRICS cross-border payment system, is a project called mBridge. And mBridge is a blockchain-based bank-to-bank ledger that facilitates the settlement of cross-border transactions in what are called national currencies. And that particular project has been going since 2021. It involves the active participation of the Bank of International Settlements, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of the UAE, the Central Bank of Thailand, and more recently, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia. Some 31 other central banks and associated organisations are also involved in that project as observer banks. Now, that project has gone live. Tests were done a couple of years ago, and what they call a minimum viable product is now active and facilitating real live, real value transactions between entities from the participating countries.
In your recent piece for CGTN, you mentioned currency multipolarity, a term which I think has a certain ring to it. What does that mean? And is Reuters correct in suggesting that US dollar hegemony will be targeted at this week's summit?
Look, I think this idea of currency multipolarity has been an evolving situation rather than an end state per se. And I mean by that the fact that increasingly different countries who are interacting with each other are settling the transactions in units of currency denominated in their national currency. So when country A and country B are facilitating trade deals between companies in country A and country B, those trade deals are actually settled in the two national currencies, as opposed to what has tended to happen over the last 30 odd years, and arguably over the course of the last 70 years, where country A firstly converts a currency into the US dollar in particular, and then uses that to settle the accounts, and then country B, or the entity in country B, then sells those US dollars for the country B's national currency. Now, that process is actually quite clunky administratively, it is quite slow, and it is quite expensive in a couple of ways. One is that there are fees to be paid as you're making these foreign exchange transactions. And secondly, of course, you also run the risk that in the duration upon which you've made those agreements to do the trade deal, that the relative value of country A and country B's value has changed in relation to the US dollar. And so you actually expose yourself to foreign exchange volatility risks as well. Now, moving to an environment where the transactions are done in country A and country B's national currencies without the intervention of a third-party currency holds the prospects of speeding things up, reducing transaction costs, and ultimately also ensuring that the parties involved are not exposed to foreign exchange risks.
Now, some might argue, though, that perhaps Russia's getting a bit desperate in trying to rush through a new system to rival the US dollar just because it's currently being heavily sanctioned by the West and its proxies. Do you get that feeling at all?
Look, in your previous question, you asked about that comment that the US dollar hegemony will be challenged. I don't necessarily think that it's BRICS' style to directly mount a challenge per se. BRICS' style over the years has been more focused upon doing the things its members believe need to be done to enable its members to achieve their respective goals and the goals they've set for each other, whether that involves the US dollar or not. So you'll recall, for example, that about 10 years ago, BRICS set up the New Development Bank as its own banking institution that would play a more constructive role in the provision of development finance to its members rather than rely upon the construction finance or the development finance from the more established traditional institutions of the Bretton Woods system. So that's the first thing, is that I don't think that there is a full frontal assault in any regards as far as, quote, US dollar hegemony, unquote, is concerned. What there is, though, is an evolving environment where nation states, because they actually have the means now to do this, are evolving their transactional experiences with each other towards a system where the use of national currencies becomes more pronounced. Now, you mentioned Russia. Now, we know that Russia, of course, has been sanctioned over the last couple of years. They aren't the only ones. The Western powers, led by the United States, has also implemented all sorts of sanctions over the few decades, and more recently have been involved in sanctioning and freezing assets of the Central Bank of Venezuela, the Central Bank of Afghanistan, etc., etc. So this idea of the US dollar system being sanctioned or being used as part of a weaponized sanctions regime on other countries isn't new. And the experience of Russia over the last 2 years tells us something quite important. Of course, Russia's got a need to do what it's doing, which is to ensure that it can continue to conduct and grow its trade relationships with other countries without dependency on the US dollar or the euro systems. And it's successfully done that. Over 95% of its trade with China is now denominated directly in ruble or RMB. And interestingly, remarks made by Russian President Putin yesterday indicated that over 60% of Russia's trade with other countries is actually denominated now in RMB or ruble as well. So Russia has shown, firstly, that when push comes to shove and there is a need to wean yourself off the USD system, you can. And secondly, that there is a range of willing parties and alternatives that already exist that enables this move towards currency multipolarity to be consolidated.
Now, Global Times recently reported that the expanded BRICS now covers 30% of the world's land area, 45% of the global population, and 20% of international trade. Furthermore, its oil production and reserves account for approximately 40% of the global volume, and its GDP, measured in purchasing power parity, has already surpassed that of the G7. So do you think if BRICS really succeeds, that there is any chance that maybe they might just create a new form of hegemony?
Well, probably not, in large part because the only way BRICS succeeds is by giving ample voice to its individual constituent nation-state members. So the systems that BRICS is contemplating creating are actually all about ensuring that the national sovereign interests of the different member states take primacy, that the institutions and architectures that are being developed actually focus upon enabling those national economic development interests in particular to be amplified, rather than creating something that is about the United States. The fact of the matter is, Andy, the world doesn't revolve around the United States or, in fact, the collective West, as much as the collective West would like to still think it does. The world has moved on. The global majority, as you've described in the statistics you've mentioned, shows that there is significant economic heft and also a distribution of core natural resources necessary for economic development and the improvement of living standards in member states. That means that we don't need to see the question being posed that way. The member states will focus upon what they need to do. What that means for the Western powers in many regards is a question for the Western powers. The Western powers, no doubt, have plenty of opportunities to participate with and collaborate with members of BRICS. I don't see any reason why BRICS would forbid any of that. That's not the operating ethos of the BRICS network.
Last question today, Professor, and it's a hypothetical one. If BRICS truly does succeed at creating more multipolarity in the international financial system, what might the world look like?
Well, I think first thing is that we'll start to see a progressive decline in the demand for US dollars globally, because if you don't need them to settle transnational trade, then there will be less need to hold those US dollars in reserves. That's just a practical reality. You'll see central banks holding the currencies of the trading partners that they do most business with. That's number one. Number two, I think we're going to start to see an interesting evolution of the role of the USD in the non-trade component of the global financial system. So other than US dollars being part and parcel of facilitating the trade in goods and services is concerned, US dollars has, of course, dominated the financialized instruments markets of the world, whether it's in foreign exchange, derivatives, US dollar-denominated debts, US dollar-denominated stocks, etc., etc. Now, the financialized markets, denominated in US dollars, it dwarfs the demand for US dollars for trade in goods and services. So the big question is going to be what's going to happen on that front. And my own instinct is that as demand for US dollars diminishes for real value in the transactions of goods and services, and therefore there is less demand for US dollars in national central bank reserves, we are going to start to see US dollars having to, in a sense, what I'd call go back home. So US dollars are, of course, very useful in North America, where you can use US dollars to buy and sell things, to buy and sell real commodities, products, property, stocks and bonds, and participate in all sorts of other transactions in the North American economy. So that's where US dollars are most useful, and US dollars will end up having to go back there. And as it goes back there, there will be a very large amount of global reserve that will find its way back into the North American economic system. How North America then deals with that over time will be the interesting question, because if you actually let this volume of US dollars come back into the US economy, you run the risk that it will outpace the capacity of the economy and therefore cause inflation. The only way to take inflation out when that happens is for the US Treasury to increase taxes, or for the US Treasury to essentially issue more bonds, which bleeds US dollars out of the system. Now, all of those actions is going to have an impact on American living standards generally, and that's going to be the interesting test.
Professor Warwick Powell, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolute pleasure to be with you.
And that will be it for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think BRICS using blockchain is a good idea? Will the group succeed in making the financial landscape more fair? And are you worried about US dollar dominance? Let me know down below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.